People thought she was collecting broken glass, but 10 years later they stood in line to buy it back. On a cool Thursday morning in September of 1998, a flatbed truck rolled through the gravel entrance of an aging dairy barn just outside Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, carrying another pallet of chipped glass jars that nobody else wanted. The driver didn't bother backing carefully into the yard anymore. He had made the same delivery every other Thursday for nearly a decade. He knew exactly where the load belonged. Beside the weathered red barn, beyond a line of sugar maples that had shaded the property since before the Second World War, sat hundreds of wooden pallets stacked shoulder-high, each one wrapped with faded plastic and filled with glass jars rejected by one of the largest bottling plants in the region. Every jar carried the same quiet flaw: a tiny chip along the rim, barely visible unless the morning sun caught it at exactly the right angle. Too small for most people to notice, large enough that the plant could never use them for commercial food production again. The driver climbed down from his cab, signed the delivery receipt without reading it, and looked toward the woman already waiting beside the barn. Margaret Collins was 62 years old that autumn, dressed in a faded denim jacket, worn leather gloves, and boots that had carried her across the same farm for more than 40 years. She thanked the driver by name, just as she always did, then watched the forklift ease another load onto the growing mountain of discarded glass. The driver smiled politely before shaking his head. He had asked the same question years earlier, and he asked it again almost out of habit. "You ever gonna do something with all these jars?" Margaret simply smiled. "I'm already doing it." He laughed softly, climbed back into his truck, and drove away believing she had finally become one of those harmless country eccentrics every rural county seemed to produce sooner or later. The bottling plant believed the same thing. So did her neighbors. So did the accountant who handled her taxes. For nearly 10 years, everyone assumed Margaret Collins was storing someone else's industrial waste because she didn't know any better. They saw stacks of imperfect glass slowly filling a Pennsylvania barn. She saw something entirely different. She saw inventory. And before this story is over, you'll understand why one of the most successful pantry brands in rural America was never built inside a factory, but inside an old dairy barn where nearly everyone else believed nothing of value had ever been delivered. In the late 1980s, every major food bottling operation across southeastern Pennsylvania followed the same quality standards because there was no practical alternative. This was not simply a company policy. It was the foundation of the entire industry. Grocery chains expected uniform packaging. Distributors expected sealed containers that could survive thousands of miles inside tractor trailers. Federal food safety inspections demanded consistent sealing surfaces, and manufacturers built their entire production lines around that expectation. A single glass jar traveled through automated equipment at remarkable speed. It was washed with pressurized water, inspected under bright optical sensors, filled within fractions of a second, sealed by machines calibrated to exact measurements, labeled, packed into cardboard cases, stacked onto pallets, and shipped across the country without a human hand touching it more than once. Every step depended upon one simple assumption. The rim of the jar had to be perfectly smooth. Even the smallest imperfection could prevent a vacuum seal from forming correctly, create microscopic air leaks during storage, or damage the rubber sealing compound inside a metal lid during high-speed processing. The flaw itself often measured less than 1/16 of an inch, barely enough to catch a fingernail. But that tiny defect transformed a perfectly usable glass container into an unacceptable commercial product. Once inspectors identified the damage, company policy allowed no exceptions. The affected jars were removed from production immediately, recorded as manufacturing loss, and loaded onto pallets designated for disposal or secondary handling. Repairing them cost more than replacing them. Selling them for food packaging exposed manufacturers to unnecessary liability. Recycling them required transportation, processing, and energy that often exceeded their remaining market value. For large bottling companies producing hundreds of thousands of containers each week, rejecting imperfect inventory became cheaper than attempting to recover it. Accounting departments considered those pallets predictable operating expenses, no different from broken wooden crates or worn conveyor belts. Plant managers rarely thought about where the rejected containers ultimately went because their responsibility ended once they left the loading dock. That system had functioned quietly for decades, accepted by everyone involved because it appeared entirely logical. Suppliers manufactured more glass than the market demanded, production lines prioritized efficiency above everything else, and replacement inventory was always available with a simple purchase order. Very few people questioned whether those discarded containers still possessed value outside the environment they had been designed for. Fewer still understood that an object could fail one purpose completely while remaining almost perfect for another. Margaret Collins understood that difference long before anyone else around her realized it would eventually reshape an entire business. Margaret Collins had never planned to build a business around glass. She had planned to preserve food the way her family always had. The Collins farm sat on 130 acres outside Lancaster, where 3 generations had measured the passing of time not by calendars, but by harvests. Her grandfather, Samuel Weaver, purchased the original property in 1939 after returning from years of working as a produce hauler across eastern Pennsylvania. He believed that every growing season offered 2 harvests. The first came from the field. The second came from the wisdom to keep that harvest from being wasted. He taught Margaret's mother to can peaches before she was 10 years old, to dry sweet corn on screened racks, to store beans in cool cellars, and to label every shelf with the month and year instead of trusting memory. Margaret inherited those habits long before she inherited the farm. By the time she married Richard Collins in 1961, preserving food had become less of a household chore and more of a way of thinking. She believed that abundance meant very little if it disappeared before winter. Every summer their kitchen filled with tomatoes, apples, cucumbers, pears, berries, and herbs gathered from their own land or purchased from neighboring farms when crops peaked beyond immediate demand. Every shelf inside the basement pantry reflected careful planning rather than decoration. Nothing was stored without purpose. Nothing was purchased without considering how long it could serve. After Richard passed away unexpectedly in 1987, many neighbors quietly assumed Margaret would sell the property and move closer to town. Instead, she simplified the dairy operation, leased part of the cropland to a nearby family, and devoted more of her time to preserving seasonal foods that local farmers often could not sell before they spoiled. She spent countless mornings talking with orchard owners, vegetable growers, and roadside market operators, listening far more than she spoke. Patterns slowly emerged. Every season someone had more produce than buyers. Every season, perfectly good food disappeared simply because there were not enough containers ready when the harvest arrived. Margaret rarely described herself as an entrepreneur because that was never the identity she sought. She considered herself a caretaker of useful things. Her father often repeated a sentence she never forgot. He would say that waste begins the moment people stop asking what something could become. That belief settled into Margaret's thinking as naturally as rain soaking into fertile soil. Years later, when an unexpected opportunity quietly arrived at her gate, it did not look like the beginning of a company. To her, it simply looked like another useful thing that someone else had stopped understanding. The man responsible for disposing of the rejected inventory was named Thomas Granger, and he had spent 23 years managing production logistics at Keystone Valley Bottling Company, one of the largest food packaging facilities in southeastern Pennsylvania. Thomas believed in measurable efficiency because every part of his career depended upon it. He tracked throughput by the hour, waste by the pound, labor by the minute, and equipment downtime to the second. If something failed to meet specification, it left the building. That was not personal. That was procedure. His office overlooked the loading docks where hundreds of shipments moved each month, and from those windows he saw pallets, invoices, forklifts, and schedules instead of individual objects. Every rejected container represented a completed accounting entry, not a future opportunity. Several times each year Thomas suggested sending the imperfect inventory directly to industrial recycling facilities instead of storing it temporarily. Recycling contracts were expensive, transportation costs continued to climb, and available landfill space faced increasing regulation. Then someone in purchasing mentioned a widow outside Lancaster who was willing to accept the loads at almost no cost, provided the company delivered them during existing truck routes. To Thomas, the arrangement solved a budget problem without creating another one. The finance department appreciated the lower disposal expenses. Warehouse supervisors recovered valuable floor space. Truck drivers eliminated unnecessary return trips with empty trailers. Nobody inside the company questioned what happened after the deliveries because the numbers all moved in the right direction. Outside the factory gates, however, the conversations sounded very different. Neighbors driving past the Collins property noticed the growing stacks and quietly wondered why anyone would fill productive farmland with material that had already failed inspection. Some joked that Margaret had mistaken herself for a recycling center. Others believed loneliness after losing her husband had simply changed her priorities. Even local business owners dismissed the idea that discarded containers could support anything resembling a serious enterprise. They understood grocery stores, hardware suppliers, feed mills, and equipment dealers because those businesses followed familiar rules. What Margaret appeared to be doing fit none of them. She rarely responded to the comments because explaining her thinking would have required convincing people to separate usefulness from original purpose. And she had already learned that most individuals stopped listening the moment an idea challenged their assumptions. Instead, every new shipment disappeared methodically into an organized storage system that only she fully understood. Each pallet received handwritten notes recording size, thread pattern, glass color, production date when available, and estimated quantity. Visitors saw growing inventory. Margaret saw categories waiting for the right moment. The difference between those two ways of looking at the same collection would eventually become the most valuable asset on the entire farm. Let me tell you about the glass itself, because understanding the material is the only way to understand why Margaret never considered those shipments to be waste. Commercial food containers are manufactured from a mixture of silica sand, soda ash, limestone, and carefully controlled mineral additives heated to temperatures exceeding 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit before being formed inside precision molds. The resulting material is chemically stable, does not absorb flavors or odors, resists moisture, tolerates repeated washing, and remains one of the few packaging materials that can preserve dry food for decades without changing its contents. The weakness that removed so many containers from factory production had almost nothing to do with the body of the container itself. Nearly every rejection occurred at the sealing surface, where automated capping equipment required perfectly uniform contact between the metal lid and the glass finish. A defect measuring only a few thousandths of an inch could prevent a commercial vacuum seal from meeting strict manufacturing standards, particularly on assembly lines filling hundreds of containers every minute. That requirement existed because factories could not inspect every filled container individually once production reached industrial speed. They needed complete consistency before the filling process even began. Margaret never intended to place those imperfect containers back into that environment. She understood they belonged somewhere entirely different. Dry storage does not rely upon high-speed industrial vacuum equipment. Flour, rice, rolled oats, beans, coffee, herbs, baking ingredients, sewing supplies, craft materials, and countless household goods require clean, durable containers rather than factory-certified production tolerances. Margaret developed a routine that reflected this distinction with remarkable discipline. Every incoming shipment was inspected by hand. Any containers showing structural cracks, deep fractures, or compromised walls went directly into a recycling bin. The remaining inventory was washed with hot water, carefully dried, sorted by capacity, and fitted with replacement lids purchased from regional suppliers. She tested threaded closures individually instead of relying upon automated machinery. If a lid seated securely and the container remained stable through repeated opening and closing, it moved onto another shelf for future use. What manufacturers rejected because they produced food at industrial scale, Margaret evaluated according to practical household performance. Those were two entirely different standards serving two entirely different purposes. She was not lowering quality. She was redefining the question quality was supposed to answer. While everyone else focused on why the containers had failed their original assignment, Margaret quietly concentrated on everything they could still accomplish. That difference in perspective remained almost invisible throughout the 1990s. But markets have a habit of rewarding people who recognize overlooked utility long before everyone else notices it. By the spring of 1996, the routine had become so ordinary that most people stopped noticing it altogether because ordinary things rarely attract much attention. Every Tuesday and Thursday, another trailer arrived at the Collins farm carrying inventory that no production manager expected to see again. Every Wednesday and Friday, Margaret worked alone beneath the old timber beams of the converted dairy barn with the same quiet discipline she had followed for years. She opened every crate by hand, inspected every container beneath two suspended fluorescent shop lights, separated them according to capacity, thread finish, and glass color, replaced worn closures with new food-grade lids purchased from a supplier in Ohio, updated handwritten inventory cards, and returned each completed group to one of 64 numbered storage bays she had built from reclaimed hardwood shelving. By the middle of 1996, her ledgers listed more than 48,000 usable containers arranged into nearly 100 standardized inventory categories. Nobody outside the farm knew those numbers because Margaret never discussed them. She did not purchase advertising space. She did not attend trade conventions. She did not hire sales representatives. She simply continued preparing inventory for customers who did not exist yet. Friends occasionally suggested that she should sell everything for recycled glass before the storage buildings filled completely. A banker from Lancaster asked whether maintaining nearly 50,000 pieces of inventory without confirmed buyers created unnecessary financial risk. Even Thomas Granger mentioned during one delivery that the bottling company would understand if she wanted to end the arrangement because the accumulated volume had become difficult to ignore. Margaret answered each conversation almost exactly the same way. She said that timing mattered just as much as quality. Most people assumed she was talking about crops because farmers often stored grain until prices improved. Margaret meant something far more specific. She believed markets changed long before people recognized that they had changed. During those quiet years, she began assembling complete pantry collections instead of individual products. Quart containers stayed with matching quart containers. Half-gallon sets occupied dedicated shelving. Smaller spice collections were packed alongside replacement lids, printed labels, and simple organization guides she designed herself after measuring cabinet depths and pantry shelves inside dozens of traditional Pennsylvania farmhouses. No customer had requested those improvements because almost no customer knew they would eventually need them. Margaret prepared them anyway. Her grandfather had always believed that harvest rewarded preparation rather than hope. She carried that lesson into every decision she made because she understood something that almost everyone else overlooked. Opportunity never arrives carrying its own supplies. It arrives expecting someone to have quietly prepared them years before. In the autumn of 2008, the advantage Margaret had been building quietly for more than a decade finally met the moment it had been waiting for. The financial crisis reached nearly every corner of the American economy, but another problem spread through the packaging industry at almost the same time and received far less public attention. Glass manufacturers reduced production as commercial orders slowed. Several regional suppliers eliminated lower-volume product lines, and the containers that independent businesses had always assumed would be available with a simple purchase order suddenly carried delivery estimates of 12 to 16 weeks. Large national food companies still received priority because they purchased millions of units each year. Small jam makers, honey producers, specialty coffee roasters, family bakeries, and local farm markets discovered they had become too small to matter. Some delayed product launches. Others reduced production simply because they could not find enough matching containers. Margaret noticed the shift before most people around her understood what was happening. The telephone began ringing almost every morning. First came an orchard asking for 500 matching quart containers before apple season reached its peak. Then a family-owned honey producer needed 2,000 identical pieces after its regular supplier postponed delivery indefinitely. A specialty coffee company outside Harrisburg called looking for airtight storage collections after being told the next factory shipment would not arrive until winter. The requests continued growing week after week, and every caller asked nearly the same question. They wanted to know whether she actually had inventory available immediately. Margaret walked into the converted dairy barn, opened the handwritten ledgers she had maintained for years, and quietly realized she already possessed what the rest of the market had suddenly lost. While competitors waited months for production schedules to reopen, every standardized collection she needed already occupied numbered shelves only a few steps away. She did not rush. She did not celebrate. She simply counted inventory, prepared invoices, organized shipments, and loaded delivery trucks with the same calm routine she had practiced thousands of times before anyone believed those shelves would ever matter. Within weeks, customers who had never heard of the Collins farm began recommending her to other small businesses across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, and Virginia. What looked for years like unnecessary preparation had become the only dependable supply many independent producers could still reach. Margaret had never predicted the exact crisis that would arrive. She had only prepared for the certainty that one day the market would need something everyone else believed was too ordinary to save. By the end of 2011, the operation that neighbors had once dismissed as little more than an unusual storage habit had evolved into one of the most dependable specialty packaging businesses in Lancaster County. Margaret no longer estimated inventory because estimates had become inadequate for the scale of daily work. Every shelf, every storage bay, and every pallet carried handwritten identification numbers that matched detailed ledger books recording quantity, size, thread finish, replacement lid type, and shipment history. More than 60,000 containers had passed through the farm since the first delivery, and thousands remained organized in reserve, ready for customers who often needed immediate delivery rather than promises of future production. Orders arrived from family orchards across Pennsylvania, maple syrup producers in New York, specialty bakeries in Ohio, coffee roasters in Maryland, honey farms in Virginia, and independent kitchen retailers searching for complete pantry collections instead of random assortments. Margaret gradually organized her offerings into clearly defined product families. Baking collections paired flour, sugar, and grain containers in matching sizes. Coffee collections included coordinated storage pieces with replacement closures. Spice collections were assembled according to common kitchen cabinet dimensions. Seasonal preserving collections were prepared months before harvest so orchard owners could receive complete sets before peaches, pears, and apples reached their peak. Nothing was assembled after an order arrived. Everything had already been prepared because Margaret believed preparation was the product customers were truly buying. Financial records prepared by her accountant showed annual revenue approaching $400,000, supported by repeat customers rather than short-term demand. By then, she employed 4 local residents during the busiest shipping seasons. 2 inspected and cleaned incoming inventory, 1 assembled customer collections, and another managed packing and freight documentation as delivery trucks departed the farm almost every weekday. Thomas Granger eventually accepted Margaret's invitation to visit the property after hearing her company's name mentioned repeatedly by distributors who had once ignored businesses of her size. Walking through the restored dairy barn, he recognized manufacturing codes molded into the bottoms of containers that had once appeared on his disposal reports years earlier. They no longer resembled rejected inventory. They had become carefully organized products prepared with a level of consistency that rivaled commercial distribution centers. Thomas quietly admitted that his company had measured those containers only by the cost of removing them, while Margaret had measured them by the value they could still create. Around Lancaster County, the conversations changed as well. People who once questioned the growing stacks now recommended the Collins brand to neighbors furnishing new homes, expanding family pantries, or opening specialty food businesses. Without changing the materials themselves, Margaret had changed the way an entire community understood their value. Several years later, visitors driving through Lancaster County often slowed as they passed the old Collins farm, not because they saw anything extraordinary from the road, but because they had heard the story from someone who had purchased one of Margaret's carefully assembled pantry collections. Inside the restored dairy barn, the shelves remained orderly. The handwritten inventory books still occupied the same wooden desk, and every container still passed through her hands before leaving for a new home. Success had changed the scale of the operation without changing the philosophy behind it. Margaret refused offers from larger distributors who wanted to replace careful inspection with automated sorting. She declined proposals to move production into an industrial warehouse outside the county. She believed the value of her business had never depended upon volume alone. It depended upon understanding every item well enough to know exactly where it belonged. Younger entrepreneurs occasionally visited the farm hoping to discover the secret behind the company's growth. Many expected to hear about marketing strategies, financing, or manufacturing partnerships. Instead, Margaret usually walked them through the storage aisles in silence before stopping beside one neatly organized shelf. She would lift a single container into the light and say that people spend too much time asking what something is worth today and almost no time asking what it might become tomorrow. That sentence stayed with many of them long after they returned home. In time, other manufacturers throughout the region quietly began reevaluating materials they had always considered unavoidable losses. Some developed secondary product programs. Others partnered with small businesses capable of serving markets that large factories had never noticed. The change did not happen because regulations demanded it or because a consultant recommended it. It happened because one quiet example demonstrated that usefulness and original purpose are not always the same thing. Thomas Granger retired in 2014 after more than 3 decades in manufacturing. During his farewell gathering, he admitted that the most valuable lesson of his career had not come from a production report or an efficiency seminar. It had come from watching someone outside the factory recognize potential that everyone inside had measured only as expense. Margaret never considered herself a visionary. She considered herself a careful observer. Looking back across the years, she often thought about her grandfather's words that waste begins the moment people stop asking what something could become. The farm remained exactly where it had always been, surrounded by fields, quiet roads, and changing seasons, but its greatest harvest had never grown from the soil. It had grown from patience, preparation, and the uncommon habit of seeing lasting value where nearly everyone else saw only the end of a story.